Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with two scientists who are on the faculty at the University of New England, Kristin Burkholder, who is a microbiologist, and Carrie Byron, whose research is in the area of marine ecology. They've been working together for a few years now, and we talk about how they got into their field of science individually and the work they are now doing together. And one bit of news from the world of the Maine Science Festival. We are planning happily for 2022, and we'll have more details about that come the fall. But until then, if you're looking for a way to broadcast your love of Maine science, you can check out our new store. All of the proceeds go to support the Maine Science Festival so that we can keep the festival free and available to all. I have included a link to the Maine Science Festival store in the show notes. Carrie and Kristin, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. You're both at the University of New England, and you both do different things. But I also know you're working together, which is one of the things we're trying to explain to people is that science isn't in a box, right? There's not biologists over here, and there's a lot of more interdisciplinary work going on. So I would love to know how you each got into your science fields, and then we'll dive into what you do and how you're working together.
So I'm Kristin, and I'll start. So I am from Virginia, and as a kid growing up, I got to spend a lot of time on family farms and whatnot. And I wanted nothing more than to be a veterinarian. Like, that's what I've wanted to do since I can remember. And so I went to Virginia Tech for my undergrad because they had a good pre-vet program. And I will say I didn't know anything about, what science could be, or at least science careers could be outside of the traditional, like vet school, med school, that sort of thing. But I did learn while I was there doing my undergrad that to be competitive for that kind of program, you needed to do undergraduate research. And so I joined a lab. It was actually a dairy nutrition lab in the dairy science department at Virginia Tech. And I worked for an incredible woman named Dr. Catherine Knowlton. She's a dairy nutritionist. She's very good at what she does. And I learned about research. She gave me my own independent research project, and I just absolutely loved it. I think what helped was that I had such a good mentor. While I was doing that, I also had the opportunity to help be a teaching assistant for anatomy and physiology. And so it was kind of like a 2-year period during my undergraduate where my eyes opened to something beyond just going and being a veterinarian. And so I really, by the time I graduated, I really kind of had in my mind, well, maybe being a veterinarian isn't the only thing that could be interesting. Maybe I'd like to be a professor, because I see that professors do research and they get to teach, and both of those things I thought were pretty cool. So I went to do a master's degree. I thought I'll kind of dip my toes into research a little bit more. So I actually ended up going to Purdue University in Indiana, and I joined a lab in the animal science department there, but I was studying microbiology, kind of like an agricultural focus on microbiology. And I loved it so much, I ended up staying at Purdue and doing the PhD. I moved over to the food science department. I was still, kind of a budding microbiologist. So in my PhD program, I worked with foodborne pathogens, so bacterial pathogens. And I was trying to understand how these pathogens could initiate infection in the host. Once someone has consumed food that's contaminated with pathogens, what are they doing to actually help them burrow through the intestine and spread throughout the body? And while I was there, I was able to, learn a lot about not just basic science like pathogenesis, but also food safety, right? And how foodborne pathogens survive in different foods and how we can mitigate that. And then from there, I did a postdoc at the University of Michigan. I wanted to learn a little bit more about infection, but not just from the bacterial side of things. I wanted to learn about the immune response to infection. So I worked in a lab with another fantastic mentor. Her name is Dr. Miria Reardon at the University of Michigan Medical School. And I learned a lot about the immune system and how it functions. And then from there, I came to UNE. I feel very, very fortunate that, I was able to land at a university where I can do research. I can also teach. I can do research with young students, so undergraduates and master's students. And I came here thinking that my lab would be focused mostly on infection and infectious processes used by bacteria. And we do that. We do that. So we have some projects looking at bacterial pathogenesis and strategies of infection. But since I've come here and I've gotten to work with partners like Carrie, I've been able to branch out. And so not only am I studying like strategies or mechanisms of infection, but I'm also studying how can we reduce risk of infection, specifically if we're thinking about food safety and keeping food products, especially local food products, safe for human consumption. I guess the last thing I'll end with is I think that for me, what really kind of pushed me to this place where I am is the mentorship that I had. And they really kind of modeled to me like who is a scientist, what is a scientist, and as well as an educator.
Hi, I'm Carrie Byron. I'm faculty in the School of Marine and Environmental Programs at UNE, and marine has really been a big focus for me. I grew up in the Midwest. I'm from Illinois, and so
I keep meeting all these ocean people who grew up in the Midwest.
So when I grew up, Lake Michigan was my ocean. That's the beach I went to regularly. So I did my undergrad, my sort of site map of where I've been and how I got here. Definitely not linear, but I did my undergrad at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Again, no oceans there. But I, as a young kid, had a interest in the ocean and things that lived in the ocean. And I have no idea where that came from. I just feel like it has always been part of my being. And so, it took me a while to figure out how to turn that interest and passion into a career. And at University of Wisconsin, I was very fortunate to meet some graduate students. I remember replying to a job advertisement. There were some graduate students in the center from limnology. Limnology is the study of fresh water. And they needed an undergraduate assistant. And I hadn't even had a biology class yet. I was a freshman. I'm like, wow, something at Trout Lake in northern Wisconsin. Maybe it has something to do with fish. Kind of sounds cool. It's better than going back and lifeguarding for another year. There's no way I'll get it, but I'll apply. Right. So I went in. I actually got called in for an interview by a grad student, Karen Wilson. She's now a professor at USM and a very close friend of mine all these years. She interviewed me and miraculously, I don't know why, gave me the job. She said I was very enthusiastic. And I really credit her to my career path because at that time, as a freshman in undergrad, I could have easily went down the track of sports therapy, physical therapy, or, I had so many interests. But working with her, she showed me what it's like to do field research. And I probably collected half of her dissertation data at the bottom of Trout Lake, looking at crayfish and macrophytes. And I loved it. I love spending half of my summer on scuba in a murky lake. Like, that was great. So I majored in zoology and conservation biology and a certificate in environmental studies. And that really set me on my pathway there. After undergrad, I went into the Peace Corps. I was in the Philippines for 2 years. And, that was a really important experience in my life in dictating my pathway as well, and how I wanted to do science. Because as an undergrad, I was just having fun in the field. And that's good. I didn't really care about the application of the science or what anybody did with it. I just wanted to do the science. I liked the discovery. I liked being outside. Then I go and I'm working, go to the Philippines and I'm working with these fishing villages, coastal resource management. And I start to realize that there is a compromise between your textbook ideals of, this is how it should be done. This is how to conserve an ecosystem and reality and the needs of the people. And that's a compromise. And that was a really eye-opening and interesting space for me. And all of a sudden that application of science became very important to me. It was more than just having fun outside in the field and not having a desk job, right? That I know that's my 18-year-old self, didn't know that computers were going to take over the world and all of us have desk jobs. but that really steered what I wanted to do for graduate school. And so it took me a while, but I finally found myself in a grad program that allowed me to work at that in a very applied way in my science. And what's so motivating for me now is that it's conservation questions, it's societal questions, it's industry questions that are driving and motivating my research. So almost all of my research now is applied to aquaculture, growing food in the ocean, in the coastal ocean. Particularly focused on seaweeds and shellfish, what we call low trophic level species. And I consult with the farmers. Actually was a minute late for this podcast interview because I was talking with some seaweed farmers. And their questions that they have about, how do they improve their business? How do they do it more sustainably? What is that interaction between the environment and their farms? Super interesting to me. And that's where my research is now focused on, that intersection, how between the farm and the environment. So, how is that farm a part of the environment? How is the environment supporting that farm? And yeah, at UNE, I've been able to really focus in on that and work with some great collaborators. But back to Kristin's shout out to her mentors. It makes all the difference having those mentors at an early point in your academic professional career to help you understand what opportunities are out there.
I am so glad that you both mentioned that. I've lost track of how many people have talked about mentors. And I think it's kind of the unsung story of faculty members that no one really, you just teach, right? You teach, you might do like the care and the guidance and helping people stay excited, or in my case, learn that it's not a good match for them, which is really important to learn, only comes through with really dedicated faculty members. So I really appreciate that. I think it's a part of the university and the college life that people don't understand how hard 98% to 100% of the faculty work to make that happen. Before I let you talk about your actual research right now, Carrie, I have to ask why the Peace Corps right after undergrad?
Oh, that's a great question. So during my undergrad, I was also a student athlete at NCAA Division I. It was intense, and I felt like, between my two majors and minor and being a student athlete, I was tapped out. I was doing everything I could do, and I was looking at my peers who were taking advantage of study abroad programs and were out exploring the world a little bit. And, up to this point, I hadn't left the Midwest. So I was kind of jealous of them, but I knew I didn't want to interrupt what I was already doing because I also really loved that. And so I was looking for ways to get a little bit of that experience, that global perspective, if you will. And I wasn't interested in just doing the backpack thing, the backpack through Europe. I really wanted to be immersed in another place, another culture, and get to know it. And I also knew at that time that I wanted to go to graduate school. And I also recognized how burnt out I was from my undergraduate experience, that it was a good time for me to take a pause to do this global exploration that I was wanting to do before starting my graduate career. And I'm so glad I did, because it really helped me focus my pathway.
And Kristin, I'm not going to let you go with going into your research without talking about what it was like to be at the University of Michigan as a postdoc. My son went there for undergrad, and it is a crazy, accomplished school with the most intense alumni for undergrads I've ever met in my whole life. And I'm just wondering what your experience as a postdoc, did you feel you were part of that world, or were you just an observer?
I feel like I was part of a very intense world, but it was very separate from the intensity of the undergraduate world. I drive through, Ann Arbor on a football day, and it's crazy. You can't drive through Ann Arbor on a football day. But for me, being on the medical campus, I feel like every single day, I was just in awe of the fact that I worked down the hall from famous scientists. I worked with a famous scientist. Like, I was being mentored by a woman whose work I had read and who had been mentored by actually probably one of the, most famous modern microbiologists who she had done her own postdoc with. It was intense in the sense that everybody in my lab and in our neighboring labs there used to joke that we did big science. It was big science at the University of Michigan. Like, it was fast science. It was big science. It was important science. So I would say it's not the intensity that the undergraduates experience, but for me, and I had worked with some amazing researchers at Purdue. Like, I felt the same way there. And then I went to the University of Michigan and I was like, oh my goodness, this is I had this constant sense of being in awe of the people that I got to work with and learn from. And now, I consider a lot of them to be my colleagues and my friends. And it was just such a tremendous learning experience. And it was, kind of interesting to me because, I had my own undergraduate research experience, which was very positive. And then there as a postdoc, I got to have graduate students and undergraduates working under me, and I could see them, getting this experience. And I would talk to one of the undergraduates who worked with me, and I would be like, you understand where you're at, right? Like, you understand the greatness that you are in the presence of. And I honestly don't know if she understood, because, that was normal, but it was wonderful. And Ann Arbor is just lovely. So wonderful.
Yeah, it's a neat town. Now that I've grilled you both about your backgrounds, it's fascinating to me because you're doing, Carrie, you're focused really heavily on aquaculture and the ecosystem approach and the farming, and Kristin, for lack of a better word, food poisoning and pathogens and things like that. It's not an obvious match that you two would be working together. As I say this out loud, of course, it seems to me like, well, of course you should be working together. So maybe you can explain, just tag team and let us know what the project is and how your fields are combining together.
Well, I'm happy to start here, Kristin. I think, it might be more obvious if I articulate that we have a very rapidly growing new industry in the state of Maine around seaweed, around, in particular, the kelps, right? And so our seaweed industry is it's not only growing fast, but the rest of the country, at least, if not other places of the world, are actually looking to Maine as an example. Like, what's Maine doing? Is this going to work where we are? And concerning is that the seaweed kind of falls through the cracks in a lot of the FDA, Food and Drug Administration regulations. It's neither a vegetable nor a seafood. And so it's been really hard to know, how to monitor this new crop, because right now most of it is being grown for human food consumption. There are a number of other industries besides human food, but I think the intersection point here for Kristin and I is around seaweed as a human food product. Kristin, I don't know if you want to say anything more.
I mean, I think I had mentioned before, I wasn't planning on doing food safety related stuff, even though I had somewhat of a background in it. I wasn't necessarily planning on doing that when I was here because I didn't really see an avenue for it at UNE. I saw a clear avenue for the more biomedical projects that I had brought in. But Carrie, I don't even know if you remember this or know this, but I knew who Carrie was, and we were, kind of distant but collegial colleagues. And we have an internal grant mechanism here. So faculty can apply for mini grants. And this was several years ago at this point. Carrie had applied for a mini grant, something related to one of her seaweed works. And I was on the committee reviewing the grants. And in her grant, Carrie was writing about potential applications of food and, and potential questions of food safety. And I thought, hey, I have a colleague on this campus who might have an interest in and a need for someone who can do some microbiology work around food safety. And to be honest, for me, someone who is not a marine scientist, I understood that seaweed is edible and that it is an industry. And I knew it was an industry in Maine, but I did not understand at that point how important it was and what an important burgeoning industry it was for New England and particularly for Maine. And I contacted Carrie and we just kind of started talking, and I met with her lab group. And I mean, that was several years ago at this point. And, we've been working together for a couple of years. And honestly, I mean, it has just been one of the best collaborations I've had. I feel like, we each bring such a distinct skill set and we each need each other, right? For this work. And it's just great. And to be honest, I am thrilled to be able to work on a project that has clear, application to the local economy and to the state economy. As a person, I do not consider myself, I had not considered myself an applied scientist. I had worked with a lot of applied scientists when I was in the food science department during my PhD program. But I always considered myself more of a basic scientist who understood the applied questions and how to address those questions. But I'm loving this. I'm loving this applied project. And it was funny, I was actually having a conversation with two of my undergraduates. I do want to mention the students in a little bit, but two undergraduates who were working on this project yesterday in the lab, and they were talking about how it was so awesome. They went home last weekend and they were talking to their family about what they're doing, and their family was so interested in, because they're from other parts of New England, interested in, the fact that this is like a growing industry in Maine, and their research is like directly applicable to the seaweed industry. And it's just great. It has been a wonderful collaboration.
Likewise.
So it's really interesting because you said, your other work or your main focus has been basic research. And Carrie, you said you found your path when you were in the Philippines. So how are those two merging? Tell me explicitly how this works with this project in particular, and how you need each other, like exactly how you need each other to make this work.
Okay, so what we are doing right now, I guess I'll tell you a little bit about a previous project that really got it started for us. So, Carrie explained perfectly how seaweed right now is kind of in this regulatory gap, edible seaweed is. And so there isn't a lot of guidance for how seaweed should be handled, stored, and processed once it's pulled out of the ocean before it goes to the consumer for consumption. And so the first question that we had, this was a couple of years ago at this point, is, well, should we even be concerned about pathogens on seaweed that comes out of the ocean? As a microbiologist, my assumption was, yes, of course, there are going to be pathogens on it because there's pathogens on everything, right? There are bacteria in the ocean, and just like any food product, any seafood product, you have a risk. But no one had actually looked at that. No one had really paid attention to it, especially from products coming from the Gulf of Maine. And so we had a master's student named Olivia Barberi who shared her master's in marine science. She did a survey of, it was just kelp, I believe, kelp coming from various parts of the Gulf of Maine. And she found, as we expected, that pathogens are present, but they're present at low levels. And so I guess what that told us is, yes, as you would expect from anything coming out of the ocean, you can have very low levels of pathogens on seaweed. But as a microbiologist, that makes me think, okay, well, now we need to think about what happens to it once it's pulled out of the ocean before it gets to the consumer. How is it stored? How is it being processed? Because how you handle it and store it and process it can impact whether pathogens die, survive, or replicate. And so right now, what we are doing is we're looking at sugar kelp and rockweed, and we're just seeing how does the temperature at which it's stored after it's been pulled out of the ocean, how does that impact pathogen load, and how do drying processes affect pathogen load? And for these projects, we're taking seaweed out of the ocean and we are intentionally adding pathogens to it, a known concentration of pathogens. We are applying a treatment and then seeing, does that increase numbers, or do numbers of pathogens change? Do they decrease, et cetera? And so, our expertise really fits nicely together, because I don't know much at all about the seaweed industry or seaweed in general. Carrie is the expert in that. Carrie, she works with industry partners. She, manages all of that. And then I am the lab scientist. So I am the person who's directing the microbiology part. Once we get the seaweed into the lab, how are we doing the microbiological assays? So I just feel that our two sets of expertise really work well together here.
I just wanted to add that, our current work right now, Jessica Vorse is our current student continuing this work, and she's funded from Maine Sea Grant. And such an important part of our work right now is, speaking with industry, with the growers and the harvesters, and understanding what are their questions around safety of these products. So they really informed a lot of our methods, our experimental methodology, and why we're choosing, drying in this way or that way, what the treatments are that we're applying to the seaweed. And so that's another really important part of our work. It's not just Kristin and I, it's also the industry, farmers and harvesters.
So are you picking it based on what the farmers are asking, can they do? Or are you looking at maybe a different range, like this farmer does this farmer does this? Is it a question, or is it tell me that what I'm doing is okay? Maybe that's the same question.
It's, well, maybe this will help. Chris and I, right, we propose what we think would be helpful, right? Based on what we think we know about industry practice and need. And then we take that to the industry members and say, how good did we do? Okay. Is this going to tell you what you need to know? Is this going to help you continue to produce safe products? And we haven't had any illness so far from these products, which is great. And we want to keep on that trajectory even as our industry expands here, right? And so that we actually had a formal exchange and process with the key people that helped, tweak and realize, oh, well, that part of our experiment maybe wasn't as important. But, oh gosh, this other thing is, we need to figure out how to add this in. And so it's really helped modify our focus and our approach.
So the farmers are guiding you in what is most important to them, and you're responding with or telling them, yes, that's safe and this is good, or you'll come up with something and they'll say that is totally not applicable. We don't do it that way. Something like that. Like that back and forth all the time. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. Both. Right. So, they'll say this is important. And then Chris and I can design an experiment to address that important thing, or Chris and I might think this other thing is important, but they'll be like, not really. So we know we don't have to put our resources there, that there's other priorities. So they tell us what's important. We design the experiment to address that question. And then they also help us prioritize, because there's no end in questions and curiosities. So where do we start?
So I have two questions. I'll start with one that both of you can answer in different ways. Carrie, you said people all over the world are looking towards Maine to answer some of these questions. And Kristin, you said your students are from other parts of New England and they're deeply fascinated by what's happening. It sounds to me like those are intertwined. I guess my question is, why is Maine so far ahead of the rest of the country with this? And how many people are looking to Maine so that they can then do some of the work in their own waters? And I don't know how you're going to answer that, but I'll let you go.
Well, I'll start with the industry piece, and then maybe we can talk about the student piece. Why is Maine a leader? We have amazing natural resources here for growing seaweed. And there have been some very key players through time to initiate this industry. I would say, Maine coast sea vegetables really started with the wild harvest of seaweeds and started the industry. And then, I'll name Tolif Olson, Ocean Approved, and Paul Dobbins. When they had Ocean Approved, they really figured out how to grow sugar kelp on a line in the Gulf of Maine. And so I think that was another really key contribution to the growth of this industry. And there have been a number of other very important players as well in figuring out how to do it and catering to certain markets and industries. I can say Alaska is right on our heels. So Maine and then Alaska, are the two biggest growers, producers in the US. Certainly there's other regions of this globe that have been growing various species of seaweeds way longer than we have, particularly Asia and some other places in Europe. But as far as the US, Maine is right now, just ahead of Alaska, and we're the two big players in the US. So why? I think it's just having those key people figure it out, find the markets, and how to do it.
And do the students, Kristin, want to go back to their states and do the same thing there?
It's a good question. So the students that I'm working with right now are, they are biology majors, and I think that their interest is more in the microbiology side rather than, the seaweed production side. They think it's super cool. What I imagine they will do with the experience that they're getting right now is they will use it to help them go places like graduate school to study microbiology. I do want to take a moment and just name the students who are working with us. So Carrie just said Jessica Boris. She is our master's student. She is actually getting her master's in marine science with Carrie. And so I anticipate that Jessica probably will want to go on and be part of, maybe the aquaculture industry. She has expressed some interest in that. And she's going to have a fantastic background in microbiology as she does that. The undergraduates are Colleen Moody and Lyle Masoya, and they are biology majors. And I think they are more interested in pursuing microbiology in terms of graduate school and careers.
So what do you two think about how the warming of the Gulf of Maine is going to impact both the farming and the microbial levels? A nice light question for you both.
I'm like, where do I start with that loaded question? So yes, Gulf of Maine is warming very fast, right? We know that. We are seeing environmental change. I don't think that we are at a place to answer that question yet. I think we're still a few steps from that. Right now we're just trying to characterize what's there, what's the risk, what do we need to be concerned about? Then the next step is, okay, how do we predict it? What do we do about it? And I don't feel like that we have enough data yet that are equipped to even start answering that around, at least this project on food safety. And Kristin, maybe you have another perspective.
No, I agree. I think there's a lot of speculation, but we don't have enough data. But, there's literature out there that shows that some pathogens that are more often associated with warmer waters, further south, are being found with increasing frequency, in waters, on coastal New England and Maine, like some species of Vibrio bacteria, which can be, some of them can be foodborne pathogens, are starting to show up with more prevalence in colder waters. And so, of course, we can, from a microbiological standpoint, we can speculate that as waters warm, we might start to see increases in, foodborne pathogen contamination of any food that's coming out of the ocean. And so I think that makes what we are doing even more important. So if we can kind of get ahead of that curve and understand, okay, let's just assume you have a product that could be contaminated by pathogens. Let's get as much information as we can about what is the safest way to store it, to dry it, to further process it, to minimize that risk and keep it low. And I think that information is just going to become more and more important as the potential risk of, pathogens growing in the water increases.
That makes sense. One of the things the festival has done, we commissioned a composer to write about climate change in the Gulf of Maine, and that was supposed to be our headliner event for 2020, and that didn't happen. But to get him up to speed, he met with people all up and down who are working in the Gulf of Maine, and learned about their science. So it's been prevalent it's been really important for the Science Festival for years now. We talked about trying to do this merger, and I know it's been something that has put a really difficult unknown in a lot of research, because you're trying to study for now, but you're also trying to project what might be happening. And with the Gulf of Maine warming so fast, it's really hard to figure out what that balance is. So I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I didn't mean it as like, you have to answer this. I just think it's really important to remind people that is something that is always there. Yes. There's just no way around it right now. And if we don't even know what the baseline is, how can we project what's next?
Exactly.
What other projects do you guys have? This cannot be the only project you're working on, right? Because that's not how faculty research works, even in a smaller scale. So if you each want to take just a little bit of time and tell me what else you're working on, that would be really great.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I have a couple seaweed projects ongoing right now. The other one consuming most of my attention next to this food safety project is looking at the ecosystem services that seaweed farms might be providing. So this work is funded by the Nature Conservancy, and the Nature Conservancy is very interested in restorative aquaculture. So we can grow things in the ocean for purposes other than just to eat them. They might, we could grow seaweeds or shellfish for restoration purposes, for example. And so couple that with the challenge that a lot of our farmers have in public perception. I think unfortunately there's still this general public perception that persists that aquaculture is bad. It's a negative thing, and it doesn't need to be. And I think too much of that perception is informed or misinformed by, a few maybe early on mistakes made by fish farming as we were trying to figure that out. And boy, have we moved past that. But for some reason, the public perception hasn't moved past that. And, farming seaweeds and shellfish and these other low trophic level species is actually akin to, gardening and taking care of the resources that you have. And we see evidence of these ecosystems becoming more robust when there's the presence of these shellfish or seaweed farms there due to enhanced nutrient cycling, or if in the case of shellfish, water filtration. They filter feed the water. There's no extra feed. We're not putting anything into the ocean to feed our seaweeds or shellfish, right? And so a lot of that goes unrecognized, and still our farmers are having to spend a lot of time and money investment in the process of even obtaining a lease and a place to farm. And so, there's this idea of a social license to operate, right? What can we do to improve that, to improve the public perception, maybe attract new consumers, enhance awareness around sustainability and that sort of thing. And so the Nature Conservancy and me, we're really interested in understanding what these farms are providing to the environment and the function of that environment and ecosystem, beyond just providing a food product to the market, right? And so another one of my graduate students, Emily Scott, is doing things like putting GoPro cameras on farms and little invertebrate collectors and taking water samples to better understand what habitat these farms are providing, what other biodiversity might be surrounding these farms. And hopefully we can get a better understanding of these habitat and supporting services that these farms are providing. So that's another one of my big projects right now. And I'll pause there and let Kristin go.
So my other projects are much more kind of biomedical pathogenesis focused. And in that area right now, my lab is interested in bacterial biofilms. And biofilms are something that all bacteria mostly can make, and they're important, in the industry, they're important in the environment, but they also have really kind of negative impacts on healthcare and human health. So we are specifically interested in biofilms that are formed by staph bacteria, so species of Staphylococcus. So for your listeners who don't really know what biofilms are, it's a situation where bacteria land on a surface, adhere to a surface, and they essentially start replicating and they start secreting a slime. And so they form a very thick, dense, difficult to remove film or slime, essentially, that is just filled with bacteria and some carbohydrates and proteins that they secrete. In terms of staph bacteria, staph species are very commonly found on human skin. And so in situations where a person goes to the hospital and needs to have, let's say, an IV catheter placed, or let's say they are going in for a knee replacement and they're having, like an indwelling medical device placed in the body, it is possible, and it does happen, that sometimes those catheters or those indwelling medical devices will get contaminated by staph, either from the patient's skin, from the hospital environment, maybe from healthcare providers' skin. And so in that situation, when the staph get into the body, they're on this device or on this surface, they flourish, they replicate like crazy, and they can start to form biofilms. And that can lead to pretty persistent infections that can spread. They can persist and spread throughout the body. And so we have two projects around biofilms. One is in understanding or trying to figure out, is there a way that we can mitigate biofilm formation or, do a better job of killing the bacteria that are in the biofilms? Because once bacteria form biofilms, the biofilm slime matrix itself is pretty impervious to antibiotics. It's hard for our immune system to go in there and gobble up those bacteria when they're sitting in the biofilm. And so we are looking at the effect of a variety of different compounds on, first, preventing formation of biofilms, and also, do we have compounds that might enhance the ability of our existing antibiotics to penetrate and kill the bacteria in the biofilm? So I have a master's student named Katie Rose, who is working on that project right now. Another side of the biofilm story is much more of a pathogenesis related one. I have an undergraduate named Lauren Cooper who's just started this project. And this is a project where we're trying to understand how the bacteria that are pre-biofilm stage versus in the biofilm versus bacteria that have broken off of biofilms, which does happen in the body, how they behave differently when they encounter immune cells. And some of our preliminary data suggests that the bacteria that have broken off of mature biofilms, which is something that can happen in the body if you have a biofilm infection, some bacteria will be released from the biofilms periodically. Some of our preliminary data suggests that though in that stage, in that what we call biofilm release stage, they might actually be like extra hardy when it comes to their interactions with our immune system. So that's kind of like my basic science, side of what I do, trying to understand how they're causing infection, like what special things are these bacteria doing, as well as is there a way that we can mitigate that?
The only regret I have is that I can't talk to both of you about both of those longer, just because I want to be cognizant of your time. That's really cool. I think if you both are willing at some point, in a year or two down the road, I'll talk to each of you about your projects. I think it's really cool. I think it's fascinating that the two of you with such different backgrounds in science are found this really cool project to work on together. I think it's great. It's really neat. And I will say it again. I've said this to many, many people. I think UNE is one of those far too hidden secrets in Maine. They do really extraordinary work. What you get done with undergraduate students and master's degree students is kind of remarkable. And I think it's a real testament to what UNE provides for its education. I've always loved going down and seeing different folks who are doing the work. So to meet two new people doing it, new to me doing it, I really appreciate it. So thank you both.
And thank you. It was really, really nice to be part of this.
Yes.
All right. And I forgot to, Carrie, I lived in Providence for 5 years. My husband lived there for 7. So when I saw that you went to URI, I was like, oh my gosh, first there's the Ann Arbor with Kristin, and then there's URI with Carrie. Like all these people have these weird connections. So
yeah, I did my doctorate work at University of Rhode Island, and that's with Barry Costa Pierce. And so he really steered me into this world of aquaculture. And, going back to how we started this conversation around grid mentors, like he's been such a cheerleader and champion of me since I've met him, and, helped me define that path of how my science can be applied.
That's right. I forgot he was at URI. He's another one of my people that I always love to run into and talk to and kind of see. He's so many layers over me, what he does. And I'm like, I just want to try to catch up. So that's really cool. So thank you both very much. I really do appreciate it. And I hope you're able to stay relatively cool on this brutal day. So thanks again.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast has received support from the Maine Technology Institute and is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is produced and edited by me, Kate Dickerson. I received production support from Miranda Bouchard and social media support from Next Media. The Discover Maine theme is composed and performed by Nick Parker.